Chapter 23 America and the Great War. The road to war. In Europe, there are conflicting alliances, a British and German rivalry, nationalist movements in Austria, and in Hungary, Franz Ferdinand was taking a tour in Serbia where he was assassinated. So then, because of that, Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. Serbia asks Russia for help, and virtually all of Europe enters the conflict. So Wilson proclaims neutrality, though Americans have loyalties to certain countries. The British blockade Germany, and America continues trade with Allied powers, but not with the Central Powers. They help with the Allied power supplies, so this makes them less neutral. Germany begins submarine warfare and sinks the Lusitania, which is a British ship with some American citizens on board. Wilson demands Germany stop submarine warfare, and the Allies try to fight against Germany. However, Germany restarts the attacks and attacks a French ship called the Sussex also with Americans on board. So there's increased tensions between the U.S. and Germany. So Wilson has some obstacles that are keeping him from going to war, such as domestic politics, conflicting factions, preparedness versus pacifism. And then Wilson narrowly wins re-election because he kept us out of war. However, soon after his re-election, he begins more supporting war. So his rationale for war is a new progressive world order with the League of Nations to keep the peace. His rationale was in a document that he called 14 Points. Germany wanted to cut off supplies from the British and collapse the Allies before the U.S. intervention. However, the Zimmerman telegram was from Germany, intercepted by the U.S., and it was asking Mexico to join the Germany's side in case the U.S. got in the war. So this built sentiment for war in the U.S. So Wilson declares war, and it is a war for the progressive world order. War without stint. So there was a stalemate in Europe. The U.S. aids in naval warfare, however, this is not enough. They need more ground forces. Russia leaves the war, making more Germans available to fight in the other areas. America didn't have enough troops, so the Selective Service Act drafts 3 million men. So with the draft plus volunteers equals the American Expeditionary Force, which is the most diverse U.S. force in history. It included women and blacks, although most were non-combat. General John Pershing leads the American troops to join the Allied forces in trench warfare, which involved horrible conditions, and the war seemed endless to European countries. In the Battle of Chateau Thierry, the Americans helped the French against the German offensive, and then the Americans begin their own offensive. In the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, that's an American offensive pushing Germans back and cutting off their supply lines. During this war, technology is much improved from past wars. They have higher powered artillery, forced trench warfare for some protection, poisonous mustard gas, which requires them to wear gas masks. It's the first war with airplanes, a modern navy using new technology, and submarine warfare. However, while there are huge casualties for most countries during the war, the American casualties are low in comparison. The war in American society. So we have to finance the war somehow. So what we do is we sell liberty bonds to the public through patriotic appeals. There's also new, higher taxes. For the war, we organized the economy. We divided it into sectors like transportation, agriculture, etc. This helped meet war needs. The War Industries Board coordinates government purchases of military supplies. However, because of mismanagement, is ineffective. Bernard Baruch is head of the War Industries Board. He's a partner of business who controlled the WIB, which controls war production as well as prices. There are also advantages in a cooperative relationship between the public and private sectors. The National War Labor Board gets temporary gains for workers, however, workers still used strikes. In the Ludlow Massacre, the state militias try to break up a mine strike, but it ends up in a battle in which 39 people died. Because of the war, there is economic growth in many sectors, such as agricultural production, manufacturing, and jobs for minority groups, since most of the white males are gone off to war. There's a great migration of blacks from the south to the north in search of opportunity and increased freedom. So there's a growth in black communities. However, this also increases conflict with whites and race riots. For women, there are new opportunities for employment. They were able to get what were men's jobs and fill in those until the men returned back from war. However, after the war, they lost a lot of their gains they made during the war. The search for social unity. There was a peace movement. Not everybody supported this war. Most support was from the women's movement and the Women's Peace Party. However, there was also strong support for the war, with patriotism, and efforts were made to unite public opinion. The Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, was a huge propaganda campaign. They went from giving facts to describing the Germans as horrible savages. The Espionage Act gave penalties for obstructing the war effort. It was the government's coercive efforts to suppress dissent. In addition, the Sabotage and Sedition Acts outlawed opposition to the war and criticisms of the president or government. The targets of these acts were anti-capitalist and anti-war groups like socialists and radicals. The American Protective League was a citizen group that tried to root out disloyalty and impose unity of opinion. With this was the repression of immigrants, particularly German, even though the German Americans usually supported America's cause. The idea of 100% Americanism celebrated all things American and attacked ideas in people that were foreign or un-American. The search for a new world order. So in Wilson's 14 points, he wanted to establish new post-war boundaries, an international standard of conduct, and a League of Nations. It was idealistic, but it had its flaws. There was no plan for implementation or thought of no thought about economics after the war. However, European countries didn't like Wilson's superior attitude. They wanted to gain something from the catastrophe. Wilson was against the Republicans who had majorities in the Congress. However, Wilson was the only true power in negotiating peace. In the Paris Peace Conference, there was Wilson from the U.S., Lloyd George from Britain, Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. However, there are American troops in Russia fighting communism, but the Russian government survives. Wilson was unable to achieve what he wanted: freedom of the seas, free trade, self-determination, etc. And what they decided on was that the Central Powers had to pay $9 billion in reparations. This was designed to keep Germany weak. There was also the Mandate system, which placed many former colonies and imperial possessions in trusteeship under the League of Nations. Wilson's triumph was that he established the League of Nations to resolve disputes and protect the peace. However, he makes few concessions to the treaty, but then refuses to compromise. The opposition to this includes irreconcilables opposed the Treaty of Versailles on principle. Henry Cabot Lodge's opposition leads to reservations, which were amendments limiting American obligations to the League of Nations. Wilson makes a strenuous speaking tour, so that makes a huge decline in his health. And he still refused all amendments to the League of Nations. He was convinced the 1920 election would be a solemn referendum on the League. A society in turmoil. With the post-war prosperity was due to government spending, a market for products at home and abroad, as well as inflation. However, there was a 1920 post-war recession, which was unemployment, bankruptcy, employers rescinding workers' benefits. It also resulted in a wave of strikes, such as the Seattle General Strike, which brought the city of Seattle to a standstill. It eventually failed, but after its brief success. Boston's police strike was a response to layoffs and wage cuts, but because of that there was an eruption of violence and the National Guard had to restore order. The steelworkers' violent strike was defeated, which was a huge setback for organized labor. The blacks' role in the war increases the blacks' determination to fight for their rights, because when they had fought in, say, France, they experienced equality, which they didn't have when they returned back home, so they wanted to regain that sense of equality. They wanted an enhancement of their social status, escape from prejudice, and opportunities for economic gain. However, the racial climate was more savage, and white animosity against blacks, especially in job competition. In the Red Summer of 1919, there were many race riots, majorly in Chicago, killing and injuring many. The NAACP encourages blacks to defend themselves. For the first time, there is black retaliation against whites. Marcus Garvey promoted black nationalism, which was pride in their superior race and culture. On a different note, there is the Red Scare. So, because of the Russian Revolution, the Communist International was to export their revolution around the world, which leads to the development of American Communist Party and other radical groups. Everybody was afraid that everybody was a communist. Bombings increased the opposition to radicals, and this reinforced 100% Americanism. Nearly anything out of the ordinary was viewed and punished as radicalism, or communism. The Mitchell Palmer raids alleged radical centers. He did not discover the weaponry that he believed was there. In the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, they were both charged with murder. They were both anarchists. They claimed innocence, but the biased judge and the questionable evidence leads to their death sentence. So, because of the economic problems and the feminist demands and the labor unrest and radical tensions and anti-radicalism equals disillusionment and decline in reform. In the election of 1920, Wilson wanted the campaign to be a referendum on the League of Nations. The Republican nominee, Warren G. Harding, promised a return to normalcy, and he won by a landslide. And there was a new era to begin for America.